Five Nights at Freddy's Into the Pit is currently the latest release in the FNAF series and has given the community a lot to think about. From the tiniest of Easter eggs to some of the most direct on-screen looks at the biggest moments in the lore, it seems that this game could be one of the most important in figuring out the early years of the FNAF timeline. Except, can we really trust what this game tells us? Can we take the events of Into the Pit as irrefutable fact in relation to the other games? Well, today I'm here to give my take on that exact question and try to definitively answer whether or not the Into the Pit game shares continuity with its predecessors. But before we can figure all that out, we have to go back and look at this game's origins to understand where it fits into the Five Nights at Freddy's canon. In the FNAF community, there's no more contentious a debate than if the books share a continuity with the games. Since the very first FNAF book, The Silver Eyes, released all the way back in 2015, fans have been divided about this subject. In the early days, it was quickly agreed that the FNAF novel trilogy took place in its own continuity, even being confirmed by Scott, meaning that their events occurred in an alternate universe to the original games. However, something less cut and dry is whether or not the two series of FNAF short story collections are set in the same universe as the games. Honestly, I haven't read all of the books, so I don't even feel qualified to make a definitive statement on their potential continuity. Before we continue, let me set out some groundwork for all the different terminology I'm going to be using in this video, because FNAF, surprise surprise, has its own definition for what these words mean in relation to the series as a whole. Continuity is the word we'll use to describe a fictional world's history. FNAF 1-4, Sister Location, Pizzeria Simulator, and Ultimate Custom Night are all confirmed to be set in the same continuity, meaning that all of their events occur in a shared timeline. Think of it like a FNAF multiverse, where there are multiple universes all separate from one another but sharing similar stories and characters, just like in Into the Spider-Verse. All of these universes have spider people, but this Peter Parker is different to this Peter Parker. These two Peters would be considered parallels to one another. A parallel is when a character, location, or event is present in two separate continuities simultaneously. Just because there's a missing children's incident which occurs across every FNAF continuity doesn't mean that they're all the same. Sometimes it's 5 kids, sometimes it's 6 kids, sometimes it happens in 1985, others it's in 87, you get the idea. We can usually use parallels to learn things about different versions of characters or events, but they are not one-to-one. Now, for the final word, canon. I left this word till last because it's by far the trickiest to define, as Scott has used it in multiple ways over the years. For that exact reason, I'm going to split it into two sub-definitions. Canon, noun. Back in 2015, when discussing the Silver Eyes book, Scott said that the books are canon in the same way that the games are canon. Meaning canon in that context was another word for official. The Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex books use the phrase "from the series' canon" on the back of every book. So the word canon here refers to a conceptual through line for all official FNAF media. The games, the spin-offs, the movies, the books, they're all from the series' canon with an uppercase C. Canon as an adjective. When used in relation to a specific detail or part of official media, the descriptor of something being canon means it's intended to be part of that media's continuity. As an example, after the movie's novelization was released, and yes, now we're dealing with books based on the movie, a lot of people found that Doug, one of the more popular characters from the film, was mischaracterized in the book. Scott went on Reddit to explain that a particular scene fans found grievance with was accidentally left in the book, and Book Doug should not be considered canon, and that Movie Doug is canon. But of course, neither Doug has anything to do with the games or the other books. Being canon, as Scott uses it here, means as part of the movie continuity. As I'm sure you can already tell, these things can get very confusing as the games, books, short stories, and now the movie all share character names with one another, so when I say William Afton, I could be referring to any one of these versions. So, getting back on track, the Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex stories are undoubtedly from official canon, uppercase C, but the fandom is split down the middle on whether or not they share the same continuity with the games, or even with each other. While this video isn't about answering which of the books are in continuity with the games, with the very first Fright story having been recently adapted into a game, we have a much more interesting discussion on our hands. Into the Pit was the very first Fazbear Frights short story, and the game differs from the short story in a number of ways once you look at it a little more closely. In the short story, Oswald's first time to Jeff's occurs on the first day of summer vacation, and he spends most of the story returning to Jeff's over the course of the summer. Oz discovers an out-of-order ball pit in the back of the rundown pizzeria, which allows him to travel into the location's past, arriving in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, without anything but fun and good vibes awaiting him in 1985. However, in the game, once we hit play for the first time, Oswald is just finishing his summer vacation, and only his first trip back to 1985 is peaceful. Upon returning to the past, Oswald witnesses the 6 dead kids, and once he's chased back to the real world, Oswald's father is trapped for 5 nights at Freddy's. Also unique to the game, Oswald has to rescue 5 other children who are kidnapped by the Yellow Rabbit over the course of the week, and is attacked by Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica. Foxy is nowhere to be found. As far as I can tell, there's no hint of the animatronics being possessed in the original short story, which makes sense, as the only night where things go wrong in the original, the kids are clearly not stuffed. There are more and more changes I could point to between short story and game, but the point is that these alterations raise questions about the canonicity these stories hold to one another and their respective series. If you were a strong believer that the original Fazbear Frights stories were canon to the games, then this game has to be non-game continuity material. It's directly contradicting the original story, and thus can't coexist on the same timeline as the original. I've seen a lot of people be annoyed about how inaccurate some of the lore in this game is to the other Fright stories, such as timeline placement and which characters should and shouldn't exist at this time, but the point is, a lot of what happens in the main story of this game shouldn't happen by the same standards, due to it overriding the original short story. That also means you can't use any evidence from other Frights books to prove or disprove this game's canonicity to the other games in the series, as the details found there will only apply to the original books. If you never believed that Fazbear Fright stories were canon, then this game could, regardless, be a contender for new game continuity material. This would be what I've seen referred to as Fright's reboot in the community, the idea that Scott and company are deciding to canonize the original stories by reworking them as these Megacat Studio games. However, while I do see these new Megacat Studio games as reboots of their original stories, as that's just what they are by definition, I'm not so convinced that their very existence as games is enough to lock them in as part of the OG continuity. I saw a few arguments when researching this topic that went as such.
All the games up to this point, aside from goofy spin-offs, are canon. Therefore, this is also a game, and there's no reason for it not to be canon.
Well, I disagree on there being no reason for it not to be canon, but let's just ignore that and go with the idea that this being a game makes it canon. In that case, then we can never have an alternate continuity FNAF game unless it's directly stated. And we know how Scott is when it comes to confirming canonicity. I would argue that in another 10 years, we could look back at this same list of all the Five Nights at Freddy's games that have released over the years and see a multitude of non-main canon games, and Into the Pit would just be the first. Unless you think there's no way that we'll ever get a game set outside the original continuity, then you have to agree that there will eventually be a first. I'm sure people would find a lot of fault with me saying that The Week Before can't be canon because it's a book, and the Silver Eyes books are non-canon, so therefore no FNAF book can ever be in canon with the games. All I'm trying to say is that the media through which a FNAF story is told isn't necessarily evidence of which continuity it takes place in. So, okay, maybe Into the Pit just being a game isn't enough to determine if it's in continuity with its predecessors, but let's take a closer look at evidence within the game, and even from without, to see if there's anything else to determine its canonicity to the original continuity. So, right off the bat, I have a big question to ask. What the hell is up with Jeff's Pizza? Well, it's the original MCI Freddy's after having been bought and reworked into a new restaurant decades after its closure, right? Well, exactly. So I have to ask, if we are to believe that Into the Pit is canon to the original games, where does the original FNAF 1 pizzeria fit into all this? Because as far as we've known up to this point, the FNAF 1 pizzeria is the same building as where the MCI took place. But these are clearly two different buildings with very different layouts, and not a single detail seems to line up. Now, there's two rebuttals I've seen to this online. One,
The layout shouldn't be considered canon, as it's purely for in-game purposes.
Okay, so I'm not against the idea of game mechanics not directly translating to in-universe lore, but the building is so different that if you wanted to hint at something like this, you'd really have to sell me on it. Even putting 2 doors in the security office would be something to go off, but this is more than just a mechanical difference. The entire restaurant is completely mismatched to FNAF 1. 2, the week before confirms that there are large swaths of the original FNAF 1 restaurant that are boarded up and unused. That's there to confirm that the Into the Pit pizzeria just got reshuffled into FNAF 1. Okay, but then why does Jeff's Pizza look identical to the original restaurant? I mean, what are we supposed to believe? That FNAF 1's location was altered in 1989 when the place reopened, only for Jeff to decide randomly to spend a boatload of money recreating the original layout? I don't think so. Now, there is a third response, which is that this game is telling us we were wrong about FNAF 1 being the MCI location, but honestly I can't see that being the case. If this were true, then how do you explain the FNAF 1 location having a safe room, or having the Spring Bonnie suit there? These rooms were discontinued in the 80s after the MCI, so why 2 locations later would Fazbear decide to build one and hide the Spring Bonnie suit in there? Surely it would just make more sense to say that Spring Bonnie was sealed behind a false wall in 85 and the location just never changed since then, right? Let's look at some of the other incongruous details of Into the Pit to see if we can get any more hints at the game's canonicity. After all, maybe these are all retcons, or we're just completely misunderstanding the implications of FNAF 1 and FNAF 3. Around the pizzeria are recreations of posters we've seen in other games up to this point, even including the Security Breach Fredbear posters, which we can either take as fun Easter eggs or direct hints that this game does indeed fall into the same continuity as the others. In Oswald's room, the Godzilla poster can change to look like the cover for the Twisted Ones, which has to be an Easter egg, unless we're saying the novel trilogy exists in-universe, which I guess could be possible, but I doubt we're supposed to read into it that much. Foxy's Pirate Cove is out of order here in 1985, even though Ralph tells us that he himself placed that sign there when the place reopened recently. In the second visit to 1985, we bear witness to 6 dead children, obviously supposed to be the missing children's incident of June 1985, but 6? We've only ever known about 5, and we can almost be certain that people weren't screaming and running in terror over it. The kids were lured in secret to the back room. It wasn't publicly known about beyond rumors. The police only arrested a suspect due to security camera footage the day after the last of these kids went missing, and while we could maybe say a 6th was never reported, the rest of these details just don't line up. The kids are also found in a party room, not the safe room like we know they were brought to, as told to us in the other games several times. This party room gets sealed up, much like the safe room does in the other games, but they're most certainly not the same room. We get a look at this other hidden room in the pizzeria, which seems to be Afton's hideout. There's a photo, presumably of he and Henry on the wall, which looks like the one from the Silver Eyes graphic novel, and then there's Garrett's plane from the movie? How's that there?
Oh, well, come on, that's just an Easter egg for fun.
Well then what in this game isn't an Easter egg for fun? I mean seriously, every time I see somebody bring up something that clearly doesn't fit with the other game's lore, somebody is bound to rebuttal with,
"It's just an Easter egg."
But despite some people arguing that we should just use common sense to determine what is and isn't lore relevant, it's not that easy. This franchise is all about fitting together the little details and figuring them out, and as much as I've been the guy in the past to say that Scott Cawthon isn't perfect and doesn't make all the details to fit together in absolutely the best way, that doesn't mean that it's not important when details like these show up. But okay, I will admit not every Easter egg has to have lore relevance, but what about the things that we don't see here that we should be seeing? There's absolutely no reference made to the puppet, which we know for a fact was in the 1985 location thanks to FNAF 2.
I never liked that puppet thing.
And yet she's nowhere to be found. There's a defense that says, due to the ball pit being an agony-fueled memory dream pocket dimension thing in the original book, all these details or missing characters are explained away by saying, this isn't a literal depiction of 1985, it's just an altered memory of it by Agony. But then what does it even tell us? None of the lore details are reliable then, because you can just say, well, it's altered by Agony. I mean, that's not very satisfying. Sure, it's an answer, but it requires so much effort on the audience's part to make it fit that it seems like, to me, it's just simpler to say that the game doesn't take place in the original game's continuity. There's also the fact that other, newer sources haven't taken the time to clarify these discrepancies. If The Week Before really was designed with Into the Pit in mind, then why didn't it attempt to clear up the 6 kids? Or the party room problem? Help Wanted 2 doubles down on 5 kids and Charlie, with no mention of Andrew or any unknown 7th victim. There is an upcoming Choose Your Own Adventure The Week Before style book set around Into the Pit, which is going to release next year, and hopefully it will clarify some things. People seem to be convinced at this point that because The Week Before is game canon, that this book will have to be as well, meaning that the game it's based on has to be... Oh wait, what's this? The description for the book doesn't support that argument?
Dive into an interactive retelling of one of the most popular FNAF stories and the basis for an all-new video game, Into the Pit.
So now there will be a third version of Into the Pit, which will have to contend with the others for canonicity. Maybe this is telling us that Into the Pit is simply a story that Scott quite enjoys and likes adapting into new mediums. I realize I'm starting to sound a bit smug about the whole thing, and I really don't want that to be the case. I understand why people want this game to be canon, why people think it is canon to the other games, but I will go into that whole topic at the end of the video. For the time being though, let me address this final point which I've seen a lot of people reference. And it's this notion about Scott having approved and disallowed certain details from the game due to trying to align it with the lore. Now, despite hours of searching, the closest thing I can find to what these people are claiming is confirmed by Megacat is the following quote from DJ Sturf, who is a frequent collaborator / QA tester for Scott. After being asked if he could confirm whether or not Into the Pit the game was in the game's continuity, DJ Sturf had this to say.
I think what I can say is that we sent things over for approval / denial in a few different iterations. Several things were definitely removed in evaluation.
Now, note, DJ Sturf never says that these things were removed specifically to make sure the game fit into the lore. And in other comments, DJ Sturf admits that he was not present for those kinds of conversation and isn't qualified to comment on whether or not the game is part of the original continuity. There's also these quotes from Megacat employees about cut content, but all they say is to not use it as lore evidence because it's been cut, which is totally fair. But okay, let's take this at face value and assume that Scott was indeed removing things from Into the Pit for lore reasons. A lot of people take this to mean that Scott was making sure the game fit into the game's continuity. But I have a theory, shocker, I know, that Scott may have actually been trying to clarify that this game wasn't part of the same continuity. Into the Pit is chock full of unused content in the files. If you're unaware, the game was originally pitched to Scott as a fun spin-off that would be made available on an old Super Nintendo cartridge, a novelty which Scott thought would be really fun for a 10th anniversary game. However, over the course of development, the game bloomed and became a much bigger beast than originally intended. Scott said in his second interview with Dawko that there would be months-long silences from Megacat where he wouldn't know anything about what was happening. Then they would reach out and update him, and presumably this is when certain things would be approved or denied by Scott himself. Now, admittedly, this happens all the time in game development. Certain features are removed late in the process and go unused in the files, and it's not even uncommon for this to happen to FNAF games, but let's take a closer look at what was removed. We've got plenty of random decorations and alternate sprites for parts of Oswald's house, or characters, or jump scares, or unfinished animations, etc. But there are also plenty of more substantial details left on the cutting room floor. For example, here we see that at one point, Jeff's office was modeled to look like the FNAF 3 office, with the big window and box of masks and everything. Here's another office-related one. These cams in 1985 used to show that the Into the Pit Freddy's actually looked a lot more like the FNAF 1 Freddy's, which would lend a lot of credence to the gameplay mechanics aren't lore idea, if it were still in the game. These minigames here featured Vanny helping William, but they were replaced with Fazbear Frights references. How about this entire room, which was obviously a safe room recreation that used to be at the back of Jeff's Pizza, but again, it's not in the game anymore. If all of these were included, I'd have a much harder time arguing that this game wasn't connected to the others. And I think that's the crucial thing. Everything that I can find that was removed from the game, which isn't a mechanical change, seems to be a direct connection to one of the other games from the series. I wonder if, while developing this game, Megacat was just throwing Easter eggs and references left, right, and center, and Scott specifically asked them to remove anything that was more than just an Easter egg to clarify the lore. Had Vanny's minigames been included, YouTube would have been flooded with "Vanessa helped William in the MCI" videos, and if Old Man Consequences had shown up in the Balloon Boy minigame, we'd be undoubtedly trying to connect this game to UCN and FNAF World. But, in fairness, you could still argue that some of these made no sense to begin with. Removing them still could be to keep the lore consistent with the other games. However, there are plenty of details left in the game that, by these criteria, should have been removed. GGY is the top score on the arcades, decades before R. Gregory is born. Garrett's plane and the Balloon Boy figurine from the movie, despite the movie being in a separate continuity. The Bite of 83 referenced in a special deal over the phone. All of these are either unintrusive or easily dismissed as an Easter egg. If something fits without question, such as Fredbear posters existing in a 1985 Freddy's, sure, leave it in. It's just a fun Easter egg. If something is so contradictory that it makes zero sense, like Garrett's plane being in the killer's office, sure, leave it in. They're easily dismissible as Easter eggs. But in the case that something could have real implications for the lore, those need to go. They seem too much like hints and could lead to confusion. Anything that isn't directly related to this game's source material or the surrounding Fazbear Fright stories needs to be axed, lest it throws off the theorizing community. So, in conclusion, though it mightn't be a super satisfying answer, I think Into the Pit's game canonicity is far from confirmed, and as far as I can tell, beyond it simply being a video game and having the FNAF logo slapped on it, I can't see any reason that this game should be considered a part of the game's continuity. There are simply so many contradictions, mainly surrounding Jeff's Pizza and the MCI as it's depicted here, that I honestly can't take any answers this game gives us as canon to the rest of the series. I know people will disagree with this, and that's okay. It might not seem like it, but I really liked this game, and despite it not lining up with what came before, that's okay too. I think there's a tendency in this franchise to only value that which is in continuity with the games. The second something is found out to be non-canon to the games, its worth in the eyes of a lot of fans is decreased. And listen, that's totally understandable, as I myself even tend to gravitate toward the strictly canon material. I enjoy trying to unravel the mystery of the series more than anything else, and anything that doesn't further that is obviously going to be of less interest to me. That doesn't mean something has to be canon to the mainline games just to be considered good or worthy of praise. This mentality held by a lot of fans is, I think, why Scott will never make a definitive statement about the canonicity of a particular series or entry into the ever-expanding FNAF franchise. The last time we had a big continuity confirmation from Scott about anything major was to do with the Silver Eyes, where he explicitly told people it didn't share a universe with the games. And considering how the fandom views those books to this day, I'm not surprised Scott didn't want to go down that road again. I just think that Scott is aware how much the fandom at large values the canonicity of each release, and he's not in the business of shooting himself in the foot by confirming every lore question that comes his way. Now obviously there are exceptions to what I'm talking about, like the movie, where no matter how you look at it, it's a separate continuity. But people didn't go to the theater expecting lore dumps. They wanted to see their favorite franchise in a new medium. That was the selling point for the movie. But the books, new games, those are always potentially lore important, so Scott says nothing, and the fandom gets a whole new topic to debate about. Now, you can argue about whether or not that's being fair to Scott, but again, I don't think Scott's wrong for doing this. It can be a bit frustrating sometimes, but he's also just playing it smart, and considering how passionate people can get about this series, I'm not surprised he wants to avoid upsetting huge swaths of the fan base one way or the other. TLDR, no. Into the Pit is not canon to the game's timeline. At least, I don't think it is. If anything, it might be a game in the game's continuity, but that's a whole other topic for another day. If you believe it's just part of the main continuity, then fair enough. But I just personally can't look past some of the glaring issues with this story continuity-wise. Going forward, I won't be using any evidence from this game in my theories beyond the usual parallels I draw upon from non-gameline material.